Friday, February 9th, and I am here with your geopolitical news. Today, this is going to be a reaction video of sorts. I'm on a YouTube platform on Tucker Carlson's channel. This is an exclusive. Tucker Carlson interviews Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. A lot of the Western media outlets did not want this interview to happen. So we're going to do a reaction video to this interview.
The following is an interview with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, shot February 6, 2024 at about 7 p.m. in the building behind us, which is, of course, the Kremlin. The interview, as you will see if you watch it, is primarily about the war in progress, the war in Ukraine, how it started, what's happening, and most pressingly, how it might end. One note before you watch. At the beginning of the interview, we asked the most obvious question, which is, why did you do this? Did you feel a threat, an imminent physical threat? And that's your justification. And the answer we got shocked us. Putin went on for a very long time, probably half an hour, about the history of Russia going back to the 8th century. And honestly, we thought this was a filibustering technique. In fact,
Okay, so I've already previously watched this video. And so what he means by what he's saying is this video is more than 2 hours long. And so as I began watching this video, President Vladimir Putin, he begins to tell Tucker Carlson the history of Russia, but not just Russia, the history of the whole region, Russia, Ukraine, Germany included. And so it kind of becomes like, I can only gather that when Tucker Carlson was interviewing him, it may have felt like a bunch of rhetoric in the beginning. But President Vladimir Putin was very strategic in this conversation. He was basically laying out the foundation and the grounds for how we came to the conclusion or to the point that we're at right now. And so it seems kind of long. It seems very boring because he's talking and speaking about the history. And so he's going back many years. And some of you may get lost in the commentary because, like I said, once again, he is explaining the history of his country, his nation, and that region. And in order for you to understand how we come to the point that we are in present day, you have to, you kind of have to absorb the history, because then and only then will you truly understand why we're here and why this conflict is ongoing.
found it annoying, interrupted him several times. He responded he was annoyed by the interruption. But we concluded in the end, for what it's worth, that it was not a filibustering technique. There was no time limit on the interview. We ended it after more than 2 hours. Instead, what you're about to see seemed to us sincere, whether you agree with it or not. Vladimir Putin believes that Russia has a historic claim to parts of Western Ukraine. So our opinion would be to view it in that light, as a sincere expression of what he thinks. And with that, here it is. Mr. President, thank you. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable series.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
Understand that President Vladimir Putin starts this conversation with a question. Are we having a talk show or is this a serious conversation? And so are we gonna have a serious conversation so we can get to the root of this problem? Or are we gonna have a talk show where, you know, it's surface level conversation and we're not really speaking about anything of any substance? We're just going around the issues that truly are at hand. And so I find it very interesting that he starts the conversation this way.
So, if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please. Смотрите, с чего
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from. Where did Ukraine come from?
Российское государство стало
The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood.
создание российского.
So now he's already setting the premise. Where did the relationship with Ukraine start? With Russia and Ukraine? Where did Ukraine even come from? And the second part of that question is a very profound question, because that would speak to the non-existence of such a place at a previous time. So that would mean that this place did not exist. That would mean that this place was formed throughout time.
And it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862, when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
1800.
In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country. In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's younger son,
По сути, функция регента,
because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev.
пришел в Киев, отстранил от власти двух братьев,
He ousted two brothers who apparently had
членов дружины Рюрика,
once been members of Rurik's squad.
имея два центра в Киеве и
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod.
следующая очень значимая дата в истории
The
России.
next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988.
Владимир,
This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity.
централизованное российское государство.
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties,
Один язык.
one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince. The centralized Russian state began to take shape. Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne.
You know, if you could see Tucker Carlson is like, it seems like Tucker Carlson is like, bro, like, come on, bro. Like, what did you, what, like, he has an expression on his face like, you taking me, you taking me so, you, in the beginning that you start and you said, let me take about 60 seconds, a minute, to give you a brief history, you know, of Russia. And it just seems like you turned it on and you won't stop. You understand? You just keep speaking about the history of the country of Russia. And so I just find it interesting, the expression that's on Tucker Carlson's face.
Введение престола наследия.
But after he passed away, it became complicated for various reasons.
Чуть-чуть попозже, после того, как он нашел жизнь.
The throne was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brother, then to his sons in different lines.
Потом сыновьям по разным линиям.
All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state. There was nothing special about it. The same was happening then in Europe. But the fragmented Russian state became an easy prey to the empire created earlier by Genghis Khan. His successors, namely Batu Khan, came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty. They had to pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty. And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow. The southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev, began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe. This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was even called the Lithuanian Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population. They spoke the old Russian language and were Orthodox. But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland. A few years later, another union was signed, but this time already in the religious sphere. Some of the Orthodox priests became subordinate to the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state. During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population. They introduced their language there and tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians, that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians. Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that a person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or what.
And that's a weird part right there. So originally they were Russians, but then they were claimed as Ukrainians.
Was engaged in a border patrol service. It didn't mean any particular ethnic group. So the Poles were trying to, in every possible way, to colonize this part of the Russian lands and actually treated it rather harshly, not to say cruelly. All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights. They wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the third.
Yo, Tucker Carlson is like, I told you guys, this part of the interview, it seems to be long winded. And so I can, like I said, I can only gather that Tucker Carlson came to interview Vladimir Putin about present day, about the conflict that's going on in Ukraine. And, sadly, President Vladimir Putin has no choice but to give him a history lesson because, like I said, that is essentially the only way that we can come to where we are at in present day. It's the only way that the average person, the average citizen around the world will begin to understand how conflicts unfold.
13th century. Now I will tell you what happened later and give the dates so that there is no confusion. And in 1654, even a bit earlier, the people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands addressed Warsaw, I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away. So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these documents.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
But still, these are documents from the archives, copies. Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian.
So it's like Vladimir Putin is telling Tucker Carlson, I'm not just here to give an interview. I'm not just here to speak to you. I've actually brought proof of the things that I am speaking out of my mouth right now. The things that I'm saying to you, I'm not just professing these things happen. No, it's a part of their history. And so he's brought evidence to the interview, evidence that Tucker Carlson can examine, evidence that you can take with you and examine yourself. And so this interview is probably one of the most single important interviews, not just of this year, but probably of this decade, because this is a rare insight into the mind of an individual who's been deemed by so many to be a dictator, to be a ruthless dictator, to be someone who is irate, problematic, on the brink of world destruction and self-destruction. There's so many things and so many phrases and so many words they use to describe this man. But our media outlets have never opened up a forum for this man for this man to speak, for this man to be spoken to, for this man to be questioned, for him to truly explain the essence of some of these situations. These are the things that have been hidden from us. And this is the reason why there's a there's a war, there's a conflict underneath the physical conflict that's going on around the world. There's a media conflict, there's a media war. And so the powers that be that are controlling the major corporations that control most of the media that you and I consume, what I am doing right now is unprecedented, because now the general population, now the average citizen, is paying more attention to this independent news media platform more than it's paying attention to the major news media platforms. And there's a reason for that, because I'm going to be totally transparent with you guys. I'm not going to not put news out because I feel that it's going to affect me in a negative way, or because I'm being persuaded by someone not to run a certain story or not to speak about something. This is not the platform for that.
Lands, that is now called Ukraine. He wrote to Warsaw demanding that their rights be upheld. And after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. There are copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory. There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later. Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, the Pan-Russian Assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar, which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom. As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years, and then in 1654, a truce was concluded. And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed. And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia. And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in Poland. Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical land.
And so understand what Vladimir Putin is telling you. Russia went to war with Poland. And that war lasted for 13 years. By the end of that war, there was a peace treaty and they split land. So understand where he's taking you at. There's a war between Russia and Poland that lasts for 13 years. And at the end of this war, this conflict, a peace treaty was signed and land was divided.
including in the south and west. This all lasted until the revolution. Before World War I, Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization. Their motive was obvious. Just before World War I, they wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area. So the idea which had emerged in Poland that people residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians, but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff. As far back as the 19th century, theorists calling for Ukrainian independence appeared. All those, however, claimed that Ukraine should have a very good relationship with Russia. They insisted on that. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks sought to restore the statehood and the civil war began, including the hostilities with Poland. In 1921, peace with Poland was proclaimed, and under that treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again was given back to Poland. In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler, it did cooperate with Hitler, Hitler.
In 1939, when Poland cooperated with Hitler. Now, as I watched this program yesterday, and as I'm consuming it, this was a pivotal point right here. Because you and I, we've gone to school, we've learned history. Some of us consume more than others, so some of us know more than others. But this is an inflection point right here because it brings about confusion. And I'll tell you why. For Poland to cooperate with Hitler, right? And we all know that in the world wars, Russia fought against Nazi Germany. In my mind, I don't understand how history has become so reversed that now Russia is the country or Russia is the place that is adversarial to the United States of America when you were once allies. You were once allies fighting what you at that time would have considered pure evil. And so it's very confusing to see where we are today, to see that the United States most prominent, most I'll just say their number one ally is Germany.
Hitler offered Poland peace and a treaty of friendship, an alliance demanding in return that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the bulk of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg. After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Dansk emerged. Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused.
Of course.
Still, they collaborated with Hitler and engaged together in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
But may I ask you, you're making the case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. It's actually your land. Why did you wait so long?
Sure. I'll tell you. I'm coming to that. This briefing is coming to an end. It might be boring, but it explains many things.
Just don't know how it's relevant.
Good. Good. I'm so gratified that you appreciate it.
So, is it boring? Is it really boring because I am giving you the history? And Tucker Carlson says, I just don't know how it's relevant. But is it really boring because I'm giving you a history lesson of how we come to this inflection point, how we come to this pivotal point in history where we are at odds or we are in conflict with each other. And so I too, as I watched and consumed this content, felt similar ways to Tucker Carlson, but also my wanting to know, my wanting to know the history, my wanting to understand how we came to this point. It overrides my boredom. And so what started out as being boring ended up being very interesting.
Thank you. So, before World War II, Poland collaborated with Hitler, and although it did not yield to Hitler's demands, it still participated in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia together with Hitler, as the Poles had not given the Danzig corridor to Germany and went so far, pushing Hitler to start World War II.
So now they didn't yield to Hitler's demands, but they did cooperate. And so one can only imagine what that means. If I demanded you to do something and you don't adhere to the demands, well, your cooperation on other levels may, it may get you a pass in the situation because you're still cooperating on some level. So you're still complicit.
By attacking them. Why was it Poland against whom the war started on 1st September 1939? Poland turned out to be uncompromising, and Hitler had nothing to do but start implementing his plans with Poland. By the way, the USSR, I have read some archive documents, behaved very honestly. It asked Poland's permission to transit its troops through the Polish territory to help Czechoslovakia. But the then Polish foreign minister said that if the Soviet planes flew over Poland, they would be down over the territory of Poland. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the war began, and Poland fell prey to the policies it had pursued against Czechoslovakia, as under the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Part of the territory, including western Ukraine, was to be given to Russia. Thus, Russia, which was then named the USSR, regained its historical lands. After the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we call World War II, all those territories were ultimately enshrined as belonging to Russia, to the USSR. As for Poland, it received, apparently in compensation, the lands which had originally been German. The eastern parts of Germany, these are now western lands of Poland. Of course,
So now understand what he is saying. What he is saying is that Ukraine and other parts of that region were effectively given to the USSR at that time, which is Russia in present day. And the other parts were given to Poland, the previous cooperators and collaborators of Hitler. And so why as an intellectual, as an intelligent thinking individual, why would I come to the conclusion or draw the assumption that that region or that nation has ever changed from the previous regime? Why would I believe such a thing? If this place ultimately was given to the collaborators of Hitler, the demise of Hitler is unequivocal, because now you have just given back the very same land. You've given the land to one of his collaborators, which probably have the same ideology as he did.
Poland regained access to the Baltic Sea and Danzig, which was once again given its Polish name. So this was how this situation developed. In 1922, when the USSR was being established, the Bolsheviks started building the USSR and established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before. Stalin insisted that those republics be included in the USSR as autonomous entities. For some inexplicable reason, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, insisted that they be entitled to withdraw from the USSR. And again, for some unknown reasons, he transferred to that newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some of the lands together with people living there, even though those lands had never been called Ukraine, and yet they were made part of that Soviet Republic of Ukraine. Those lands included the Black Sea region, which was received under Catherine the Great, and which had no historical connection with Ukraine whatsoever. Even if we go as far back as 1654, when these lands returned to Russian Empire, that territory was the size of 3 to 4 regions of modern Ukraine, with no Black Sea region. That was completely out of the question.
In 1654.
Exactly.
You obviously have encyclopedic knowledge of this region, but why didn't you make this case for the first 22 years as president that Ukraine wasn't a real country?
So it's like, okay, so if it's not a real country, Tucker Carlson's question is, then all of the years that you have been president of Russia, why haven't you just taken it? Why haven't you made an issue about this before? And President Vladimir Putin, he is reaching that point. But it was important for him to bring Tucker Carlson through history, through time, so he can understand how they got to that point. But I don't believe that it was ever about Vladimir Putin wanting to invade Ukraine, wanting to own Ukraine. I don't ever believe that it was about that. This man is he's very intelligent, and from his posture, what I get is someone who is not imposing. Because think about that. Think about the question in itself. Why haven't you done anything up until this point? And that speaks volumes, because that is not suggestive of an individual who is bent on war, who is bent on destruction. That is not the attribute of such an individual. That shows the exact opposite. That shows patience. That shows restraint.
The Soviet Union was given a great deal of territory that had never belonged to it, including the Black Sea region. At some point, when Russia received them as an outcome of the Russo-Turkish Wars, they were called New Russia or Novorossiya. But that does not matter. What matters is that Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, established Ukraine that way. For decades, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic developed as part of the USSR. And for unknown reasons, again, the Bolsheviks were engaged in Ukrainianization. It was not merely because the Soviet leadership was composed to a great extent of those originating from Ukraine. Rather, it was explained by the general policy of indigenization pursued by the Soviet Union. Same things were done in other Soviet republics. This involved promoting national languages and national cultures, which is not a bad in principle. That is how the Soviet Ukraine was created. After the World War II, Ukraine received, in addition to the lands that had belonged to Poland before the war, part of the lands that had previously belonged to Hungary and Romania. So Romania and Hungary had some of their lands taken away and given to the Soviet Ukraine, and they still remain part of Ukraine. So in this sense, we have every reason to affirm that Ukraine is an artificial state that was shaped at Stalin's will.
Do you believe Hungary has a right to take its land back?
Wow. So so what he's explaining is most of Ukraine is parts, most of Ukraine, if you divide it into parts, it never, it, it, it would never be a Ukraine, meaning that most of the parts of Ukraine previously belonged to previous owners. And when certain parts were given up, or certain treaties were made, these parts were given to Ukraine, and hence further brought in and created the region of Ukraine. But I get totally what President Vladimir Putin is saying. The land itself did not exist as vast as you see, what you see as Ukraine. It did not exist in that sense previously. It's been add on after add on, basically, from what I'm gathering from this, through conflict, the ending of conflict, and peace treaties being made and signed. Certain lands were annexed to Ukraine, hence forming Ukraine.
In Ukraine, and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
I'm not sure whether they should go back to the 1654 borders. But given Stalin's time, so-called Stalin's regime, which as many claim saw numerous violations of human rights and violations of the rights of other states,
В этом смысле, конечно, вполне можно, если не говорить о том, что они имеют право.
one may say that they could claim back those lands of theirs while having no right to do that. It is at least understandable.
Have you told Viktor Orban that he can have part of Ukraine? Никогда не говорил.
Never. I have never told him, not a single time.
У нас с ним даже на этот счет не было разговора.
We have not even had any conversation on that, but I actually know for sure that Hungarians who live there
Они, конечно, хотят вернуться в свой территорию.
wanted to get back to their historical land. Moreover, I would like to share a very interesting story with you. I digress, it's a personal one. Somewhere in the early
Tucker Carlson's reaction, you could see the smirk on his face when he says, I want to tell you a story. It's like homie, you already telling me a story. Like you already telling me. I thought you was already telling me a story that goes back thousands and thousands of years, and now he said, "Let me tell you a story."
80s, I went on a road trip in a car from then Leningrad across the Soviet Union through Kiev. Made a stop in Kiev and then went to western Ukraine. I went to the town of Beregovoye, and all the names of towns and villages there were in Russian and in a language I did not understand, in Hungarian, in Russian and in Hungarian, not in Ukrainian, in Russian and in Hungarian. I was driving through some kind of village, and there were men sitting next to the houses, and they were wearing black three-piece suits and black cylinder hats.
So basically, what he's basically telling you is that there wasn't you Ukraine in a sense did not exist. What he's basically saying is that there were always Russians in this land. He's setting up a premise for you to understand that Russians have always occupied this land. There's never been a time when Russians have not occupied that land. Actually, they are they were first to occupy that land. And so what he's basically saying is everything was changed. You understand? Everything was changed to Ukrainian dialogue, Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian sovereignty. Everything was changed. And so that does not remove or erase the fact that there are still Russians occupying this land. It is still, and occupying is an incorrect word. So I'm gonna stop saying that. There are still Russians who live in this land, who have always lived in that land. And that's the point that he's trying to make.
I asked, are they some kind of entertainers? I was told, no, they were not entertainers, they're Hungarians. I said, what are they doing here? What do you mean? This is their land, they live here. This was during the Soviet time in the 1980s. They preserved the Hungarian language, Hungarian names, and all their national costumes. They are Hungarians and they feel themselves to be Hungarians. And of course, when now there is an infringement.
Well, that is, and there's a lot of that, though. I think many nations are upset about Transylvania as well, as you obviously know. But many nations feel frustrated by the redrawn borders of the wars of the 20th century and wars going back 1,000 years, the ones that you mentioned. But the fact is that you didn't make this case in public until 2 years ago, February. And in the case that you made, which I read today, you explain at great length that you felt a physical threat from the West in NATO, including potentially a nuclear threat, and that's what got you to move. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
I understand that my long speeches probably fall outside of the genre of the interview. That is why I asked you at the beginning, are we going to have a serious talk or a show? You said a serious talk. So bear with me, please. We're coming to the point where the Soviet Ukraine was established. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and everything that Russia had generously bestowed on Ukraine was dragged away by the latter. I'm coming to a very important point of today's agenda.
Thank you.
After all, the collapse of the Soviet Union was effectively.
Okay, so if you paid attention to what he just said, he effectively said that everything that was given to Ukraine by Russia was effectively dragged away by the latter. And so it's always been problematic. If I give you a piece of land and I say this is your land, you want to be sovereign, well, you can have this land, and this land. And then essentially you give that land to a third party. It's a conflict. How is it a conflict? Well, what if you decide to give that land to a third party who is adversarial to me?
Initiated by the Russian leadership. I do not understand what the Russian leadership was guided by at the time. But I suspect there were several reasons to think everything would be fine.
Первое. Ну, во-первых, я думаю, что руководство России исходило из того, что
First,
фундаментальные
I think that then Russian leadership believed that the fundamentals of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine were, in fact, a common language. More than 90% of the population there spoke Russian. Family ties. Every third person there has.
So more than 90% of the population there spoke Russian. That's a very key piece of information.
Some kind of family or friendship ties, common culture, common history, finally, common faith, coexistence with a single state for centuries, and deeply interconnected economies.
экономика очень сильно взаимосвязана.
All of these were so fundamental. All these elements together make our good relationships inevitable.
Я хочу, чтобы вы, как американские граждане, чтобы
The second point is a very important one.
прежнее российское
I
руководство
want you, as an American citizen, and your viewers to hear about this as well.
больше никаких разделителей.
The former Russian leadership assumed that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and therefore there were no longer any ideological dividing lines.
Инициативно пошла даже на развал Советского Союза.
Russia even agreed voluntarily and proactively to the collapse of the Soviet Union,
Называемым
and believed that this would be understood by the so-called civilized West as an invitation for cooperation and
вот чего
association.
ожидала Россия.
That is what Russia was expecting.
Now, that's a very, very, very important part because he is letting it be known that it was at a time expected that the United States of America and Russia would be unified. This was an expectation. Do you understand that if, you know, we engage in conflict, we engage in something like a world war, and we fight on the same side and we are allies, you know, there's always room for negotiation, there's always room for peace. But when you completely turn your back, when you completely abandon any any type of any type of line for communication, when you totally abandon it, it leaves the world in a very dire state.
Both from the United States and the so-called collective West as a whole.
В том числе и в Германии. Эгон Барр.
There were smart people, including in Germany, Egon Bahr, a major politician of the Social Democratic Party, who insisted in his personal conversations with the Soviet leadership on the brink of the collapse of the Soviet Union that a new security system should be established in Europe.
Помочь объединиться Германии. Но
Help should be given to unify Germany, but a new system should be also established to include the United States, Canada, Russia, and other Central European countries. Yes, but NATO needs not to expand. That's what he said. If NATO expands, everything would be just the same as during the Cold War, only closer to Russia's borders. That's all.
больше того, он рассердился как-то.
He was a wise old man, but no one listened to him. In fact, he got angry once.
Рассердился на советское руководство.
If, he said, you don't listen to me, I'm never setting my foot in Moscow once again.
Но, тем не менее,
Everything happened just as he had said.
well, of course, it did come true, and you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point, and many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. That the opposite happened, but you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China. The West does not seem very afraid of. What about Russia? Do you think convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
Запад боится сильного Китая больше, чем сильной России.
The West is afraid of strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because Russia has 150.
You know, I was just about to say that. You know, Tucker Carlson, you know, just proclaimed that the United States doesn't fear a strong China. And I don't necessarily believe that to be true. There's always been propaganda about China and just so many different things that the United States government has been trying to get the average citizen to believe that it's hard to say that the United States of America does not at least have some serious, serious concerns when it comes to China.
Could be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations. Nothing like this happened. You tricked us. I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise was that NATO would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that. We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there's no communist party.
So now, on 5 different occasions, NATO has expanded, and Russia has not reacted in a negative way. Russia has not, you know, engaged in a conflict with them because of this. But at the same time, Russia was also asking them to stop. So, on one hand, you have somebody who's infringing upon your borders or moving closer, which is an infringement all in itself. The United States of America would never allow such a thing. So, I gave many of you an example before. It's the equivalent to Russia moving into Mexico. Would there be conflict if Russia decided to do such a thing?
Power. Let's negotiate. Moreover, I have also said this publicly before.
Был момент, когда,
There was a moment when
когда серая кошка пробежала.
a certain rift started growing between us. Before that, Yeltsin came to the United States. Remember, he spoke in Congress and said the good words. God bless America. Everything he said were signals. Let us in. Remember the developments in Yugoslavia before the Yeltsin was lavished with praise as soon as the developments in Yugoslavia.
So what he's basically saying is, you know, one would think that the United States of America and Russia would be allies. You would think that this relationship would be much closer than it is, but it's not. And one has to question why why did the United States of America and its Western allies decide that Russia was to be on the outside looking in? Because what he's referring to is Russia being asked to be let in. And this is after the collapse of the Soviet Union. To be let in on the world stage.
Started, he raised his voice in support of Serbs, and we couldn't but raise our voices for Serbs in their defense. I understand that there were complex processes underway there. I do. But Russia could not help raising its voice in support of Serbs, because Serbs are also a special and close to us nation, with Orthodox culture and so on. It's a nation that has suffered so much for generations. Well, regardless, what is important is that Yeltsin expressed his support. What did the United States do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, it started bombing Belgrade. It was the United States that let the genie out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia protested and expressed its resentment of what was said, the UN Charter and international law have become obsolete. Now everyone invokes international law, but at that time they started saying that everything was outdated. Everything had to be changed. Indeed, some things need to be changed, as the balance of power has changed. It's true, but not in this manner. Yeltsin was immediately dragged through the mud, accused of alcoholism, of understanding nothing, of knowing nothing. He understood everything, I assure you. Well, I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, the Yugoslav issue is over, but we should try to restore relations. Let's reopen the door that Russia had tried to go through. And moreover, I said it publicly, I can't reiterate it. At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing President Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him, Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen? Suddenly he said, it's interesting. I think so. But in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now.
Now make that make sense, right? You have this man in your home, in your homeland, and you just asked him a question earlier in the daytime about the possibility of your nation joining NATO. You spoke to this man about the possibility, and this man responded to you in that moment like it was something that definitely could be considered, something that may possibly be accepted, only for later in the evening when they're gathering to have dinner with each other, he comes to you and he tells you, you know what I said previously, you're going to have to disregard that. There's other influencers and other powers that be that inform me that they just would never allow that. Not only do they not want it, but they would never allow it.
You can ask him. I think he will watch our interview. He'll confirm it. I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened. Okay.
Were you
well,
sincere?
It's impossible now.
Would you have joined NATO?
Look, I asked the question, is it possible or not? And the answer I got was no. If I was insincere in my desire to find out what the leadership position was,
But if he had said yes, would you have joined NATO?
if he had said yes, the process of rapprochement would have commenced, and eventually it might have happened if we had seen some sincere wish on the other side of our partners. But it didn't happen. Well, no means no. Okay, fine.
Why do you think that is? Just to get to motive. I know you're clearly bitter about it. I understand. But why do you think the West?
I absolutely believe that if the sentiment had been different, if the sentiment had been different from the United States of America, then I truly believe that Russia would have joined NATO. I absolutely believe that. Because it's just like this man just said. Why would I ask the question if I wasn't curious? If I wasn't curious to know, why would I ask the question? It would be no need. The answer is unequivocal if I'm not interested in doing such. If the idea had not entered his mind or the minds of his colleagues, it it makes no sense to ask the question. If you truly are not interested in the answer.
Rebuffed you then? Why the hostility? Why did the end of the Cold War not fix the relationship? What motivates this from your point of view?
You said I was bitter about the answer. No, it's not bitterness. It's just a statement of fact. We're not bride and groom, bitterness, resentment. It's not about those kind of matters in such circumstances. We just realized we weren't welcome there, that's all. Okay, fine. But let's build relations in another manner. Let's look for common ground elsewhere. Why we received such a negative response, you should ask Europe.
I think that's a very I think that's a very reasonable statement. I think that's reasonable. Okay, fine. You don't want us here. Okay, cool. But there's at least some other forms of business or some other forms of of communication that we can have with each other outside of what was just put on the table and then just smacked off the table. Okay, fine. But do we get up and walk away from the table? Is there nothing else to put on the table that we can find some common ground in? So one question was asked, one answer was given, and it seems that that's the end of relations.
I can only guess why. Too big a country with its own opinion and so on. And the United States, I've seen how issues are being resolved in NATO.
Ну, я же видел, как решают.
I will give you another example now concerning Ukraine.
Еще один пример сейчас приведу, касающийся.
The US leadership exerts pressure, and all NATO members obediently vote,
Даже если им
even if they do not like something.
скажу, что происходит с Украиной.
Now, I'll tell you what happened in this regard with Ukraine in 2008, although it's being discussed. I'm not going to open a secret to you, say anything new.
По-разному выстроить отношения.
Nevertheless, after that, we tried to build relations in different ways.
События.
For example, the events in the Middle East, in Iraq.
Мы
We
очень
were building relations with the United States in a very soft, prudent, cautious manner. I repeatedly raised the issue that the United States should not support separatism or terrorism in the North Caucasus,
Северном Кавказе. Но все равно предложили
but they continued to do it anyway.
политические
And political support, information support, financial support, even military support came from the United States and its satellites for terrorist groups in the Caucasus.
Now, one has to question, what does President Vladimir Putin mean by the United States supporting terrorist groups? What does he mean? Excuse me. What does he mean by this? What does the president of Russia mean by the United States supporting terrorist groups in every aspect of support? Financial aid, military aid, you name it. What does he mean? I think that's a topic that needs to be investigated, because this is the Street Icon Conspiracy Theory Podcast. Excuse me, Street Icon Podcast Conspiracy Theory Series. And so these questions, they all matter. They're all relevant. These are the questions that the members of the Street Icon Nation, these are the questions that the average citizen wants to know.
Caucasus. I once raised this issue with my colleague, also the President of the United States. He says, "It's impossible. Do you have proof?" I said, "Yes." I was prepared for this conversation, and I gave him that proof. He looked at it, and you know what he said? "I apologize, but that's what happened." I'll quote. He says, "Well, I'm gonna kick their ass." We waited and waited for some response. There was no reply. I said to the FSB director, "Write to the CIA. What is the result of the conversation with President?" He wrote once, twice, and then we got a reply. We have the answer in the archive. The CIA replied, "We have been working with the opposition in Russia. We believe that this is the right thing to do, and we will keep on doing it." Just ridiculous. Well, okay. We realized that it was out of the question.
Forces in opposition to you. So you're saying the CIA is trying to overthrow your government.
Ну, конечно, имелось в виду в данном
Of
случае.
course, they meant in that particular case the separatists, the terrorists who fought with us in the.
Yes, the CIA would love for there to be a regime change. They would love for power to be given to someone that is very well in cahoots with them, that believes in their policies and won't restrict them from anything. Because this is the only way that the United States, does business or becomes allies with any nation. It's almost like you have to give up everything just for what? As I said before in the previous video, The United States moves around the world as the world's big brother, engaging itself in all conflicts. And I find that statement to be profoundly inappropriate. The world's big brother would be a signification that the world is your family. If you're the big brother, then the world must be your relatives. So for you to engage in conflicts, to in, to to inject yourself in conflicts that have absolutely nothing to do with you, and then choose a side in that conflict, I would hate to have a big brother like you.
Caucasus. That's who they call the opposition.
Это вот второй момент.
This is the second
Очень
point.
важно.
The third moment is a very important one. Is the moment when the U.S. missile defense system was created.
Начало.
The beginning.
Мы долго уговаривали.
We persuaded for a long time not to do it in the United States.
Меня пригласили в
Moreover,
отец Буша.
after was invited by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., to visit his place on the ocean,
Там состоялась очень серьезная беседа,
I had a very serious conversation with President Bush and his team.
чтобы
I proposed that the United States
Now, this is an important part as well, because this is about the U.S. defense, the U.S. missile defense system. And Russia was asking that they not create this system.
Russia, and Europe jointly create a missile defense system that we believe, if created unilaterally, threatens our security, despite the fact that the United States officially said that it was being created against missile threats from Iran. That was the justification for the deployment of the missile defense system. I suggested working together, Russia, the United States, and Europe. They said it was very interesting. They asked me, "Are you serious?" I said, "Absolutely."
Let me ask, what year was this?
Ну, я не помню. Вот,
I don't remember.
в интернете, когда я был.
It is easy to find out on the internet when I was in the USA at the invitation of Bush Sr. It is even easier to learn from someone I'm going to tell you about.
Сказали, это очень интересно.
I was told it was very interesting. I said, just imagine if we could tackle such a global strategic security challenge together. The world will change. We'll probably have disputes, probably economic and even political ones, but we could drastically change the situation in the world. He says yes, and asks, "Are you serious?" I said, "Of course. We need to think about it." I'm told.
Вот в этот кабинет.
I said, "Go ahead, please." Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of CIA.
So basically, although Russia did not want them to build such a system, the United States' excuse for building such a system was its national security and the defense against Iran. So Russia says, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then let us be involved. Let us all be involved in creating it, making it, and we'll all have usage of it. We'll all use it for the defenses of our nations, and we'll all be together in this one thing. Can maybe this can change things between all of us. Maybe this can bring us together. Maybe this can bring us closer.
CIA and Secretary of State Rice came in here, in this cabinet, right here at this table. They sat on this table. Me, the foreign minister, the Russian defense minister on that side. They said to me, "Yes, we have thought about it. We agree." I said, "Thank God, great,
No.
but with some exceptions."
So twice you've described U.S. presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads. So it sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who are elected in your telling.
He's basically telling you that the United States president is a puppet. The seat holds no value. Because if I'm having a conversation with you and you and I, we're intelligent enough. We can have a conversation and come to an agreement right here and now. And so we have that conversation and we do come to that agreement only for you to go off and speak to whoever it is, to whatever group it is, to whoever it is that you speak to, and then your sentiment changes. The next time I see you, the conversation is different, and you no longer want to do that thing that we discussed would be the correct thing to do. Now you no longer want to do it. And if you do want to do it, it comes with so many severe stipulations that it almost makes it irrelevant to do.
Именно так.
The answer was, we're not doing this against you, and you do what you want, assuming that it is not against us, not against the United States. I said, okay, very well. That's the way it went. And we created hypersonic systems with intercontinental range.
So Russia response to the United States not wanting Russia to be involved, Russia told them, well, if you do this, then we're going to retaliate by creating systems that surpass those systems. And so the United States response to that was for them to go ahead, do what you want to do. And so it seems like what I'm gathering from this interview, and I'm only 39 minutes into the interview, that's a 2 hour long interview. But I'm already getting the sense that the United States, they have been neglecting to form some type of relationship with Russia. And Russia has been reaching out on numerous occasions, directly and indirectly. And so as you listen to this man speak, as you listen to the president of Russia speak, it becomes more and more clear that there are outside forces that are working against a relationship between the United States and Russia. And these forces are so powerful that not even the president of the United States, when in conversation with this man and come to agreement with this man, even even the president themselves have to walk back, have to retract what they said, because the outside influences are just so great.
And we continue to develop them. We are now ahead of everyone, the United States and the other countries, in terms of the development of hypersonic strike systems, and we are improving them every day. But it wasn't us. We proposed to go the other way, and we were pushed back.
По поводу решения.
Now, about NATO's expansion to the east. Well, we were promised no NATO to the east, not an inch to the east, as we were told. And then what? They said, well, it's not enshrined on paper, so we'll expand.
Это решение.
So there were 5 waves of expansion, the Baltic states, the whole of Eastern Europe, and so on.
И вот теперь
And now I come to the main thing. They have come to the Ukraine, ultimately. In 2008, at the summit in Bucharest, they declared that the doors for...
So understand the problem. The problem is that you have promised that you would not expand, and on 5 different occasions you have expanded, and then you have the audacity to come to the place that you had to know. You had to know. You had to know that the points that you've expanded to were far enough. You had to know that you were making the situation more problematic. You had to know that. And as I said before, Russia has been practicing an enormous amount of restraint, an enormous amount of patience. Because when you think about the country that you come from, to those of you that are listening, how many of your countries, how many of your governments would have allowed such a thing? This is the question that we all must answer in our minds to understand how we come to the point in present day with this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'm not going to play this whole video. This is a Tucker Carlson exclusive. And so many of you can go to his channel and you can check out the whole 2-hour video. But I just wanted to give you a brief reaction to just watching some of the things that this man is speaking about. Now, I've watched this video in its entirety, and I suggest that you all do the same. This is a very important interview because in this interview, he lays out the details. He appears to be totally transparent in his explanation as to why there are relationships and there aren't relationships. And so this is an interview that the United States government did not want to happen. It's definitely an interview that the news media outlets, the major news media outlets, are probably very jealous that Tucker Carlson had the opportunity to do. And he just let the man speak freely. Now, as I said before, the interview can be boring at times. But if you are truly interested in the truth, if you're truly interested in understanding, then for the average mind, it's boring. For the intellectual mind, it's not boring at all. It's very interesting. As I said before, this is a Tucker Carlson exclusive. Tucker Carlson interviews Vladimir Putin. This is on the Tucker Carlson YouTube channel. So I suggest you guys go to that channel and check this full interview out. It didn't have any commercials, so there was no interruptions, and the interview plays fully through. As I said before, it's a 2-hour interview, so make sure you got some time on your hands before you sit down and consume this content. Okay, so you can follow Street Icon on all social media platforms. Street Icon 8080 on the YouTube platform. Also, Street Icon Podcast, Conspiracy Theory Series has just launched merch. And this merch will be available soon. I'll let you guys know where you can go to and where you can pick this merch up at. Also, if you see this photo, you can take your phone and scan the QR code and it'll take you straight to the Street Icon channel on YouTube, where you can check out all of the content that's posted by Street Icon. Drop a comment in the comment section and let me know how you feel about this. How do you feel about Tucker Carlson interviewing Vladimir Putin? How do you feel about the information that Vladimir Putin gave? Do you believe him? Drop a comment in the comment section and let me know how you feel. Always remember, stay vigilant, stay safe. Peace.